It's time for April Patreon birthday shoutouts, which is my favorite month to do them because it is also my birthday month. I want to say a very happy birthday to Zoe, Annabelle, Ginny, Despina, Tamra, Denise, Kate, Quinn, Laura, Susie, Lark, April, Cameron, Beam, Cindine, Cody, Deborah, and then an extra happy birthday to my birthday twins. I guess that makes us triplets, Bill and Leanna. And some warm wishes to Regina as she celebrates and remembers her mom this month. So I want to say happy birthday to everyone. Don't worry about eating cake for me because I'll be eating my own cake on a special birthday trip to South Carolina with some friends. So I hope everyone has as much fun as I will be having celebrating this month. And I just want to say a very happy birthday. After Tracey Richter killed a home intruder, she was hailed as the mother who risked it all to protect her children. The dead man's mother said the whole truth would one day come out. It took a decade before that would happen, though some say the truth was always out there. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crime Lines. Welcome to Crime Lines. This case is a complicated one and a long one, so we're going to jump right into it. But I do want to remind you to check the show notes for a list of meetups, events, and live shows. I don't really anticipate doing quite so many in-person events next year. I'm wearing my wallet out a bit already, but I've really loved meeting so many listeners face-to-face so far that I also may just keep doing it till I run out of money. Who knows? But let's go ahead and get into this week's case, which is another Iowa case. It's the third Iowa case I've covered this year. I was about to joke that I'm going to give Texas and Wisconsin a break for once, but actually our next few episodes take place in Texas and Wisconsin once again. But they at least get a week off. This case starts with a young man named Dustin Wedhe who was born in Storm Lake, Iowa. He grew up with his parents and two sisters in the small town of Early. And by small town, I mean under 600 people. If you weren't related to someone in the town, you were probably related to one of their other relations. Dustin was a quiet kid who dealt with some special needs. His parents recognized this early on, so they took him to various doctors for evaluations. But his mom said that every time they went, they'd walk away with a different diagnosis. Nothing seemed to fully fit, which made it hard to know how to help him. In spite of this, Dustin was a student council member and he did graduate high school. The transition to adulthood was rocky, but he had a job at the local ethanol plant and was taking steps towards independence while he was still living at home. But then Dustin lost his job. This was a major setback for him, and he seemed depressed, withdrawing more and more. His mother, Mona, was concerned, and she mentioned it to her boss at the time, Michael Roberts, who owned a computer IT company. Michael had moved to Early a few years before in 1998 with his wife, Tracey, their young son, who was still a baby, and Tracey's son from her first marriage. While living in Early, Michael and Tracey went on to have a daughter. They had actually met Mona before she started working for Michael. When they were new to the area, Mona was initially their real estate agent, and she helped them in both buying the house where Michael did run his IT business and also a property for Michael's side business of horse breeding. When Michael heard that Mona's son was struggling, he wanted to help, and Mona welcomed it. Dustin and his dad were really close when Dustin was younger. But as can happen, they drifted apart in Dustin's teen years. There was some contention between them, so he really could use a strong male role model that he felt he could turn to who wasn't his dad. Dustin was very good with computers, and Michael had some odd jobs that he could do, but this was really more of a mentorship position than employment. Michael would give Dustin paid work to do, but he also took him out paintballing for the first time, and he would spend time with him, getting him out of the house and out of his shell. Dustin even attended church with the Roberts family here and there. With the help and support of his parents, his sister, and Michael Roberts, Dustin, at 20 years old, was making some strides. This period of time seemed to be what could have been a turning point for Dustin, where he started overcoming the obstacles on his way to independence. Because Michael was choosing to put value in Dustin, he started seeing that he had value. But that perception of Dustin and what was happening in his life and the changes that were coming would be shattered on December 13th, 2001, when a 911 call came in a bit after 7 p.m. It was 11-year-old Bert, Michael's stepson. He said that people had come into the house and one of them had been strangling his mother, Tracey. She shot one of them, but the other ran off and they needed help immediately. When the police arrived at the Roberts home, Tracey was out on the front porch, hysterical, and she just started repeating, "He's upstairs, he's upstairs." And it was upstairs, in Tracey's bedroom, that first responders found the body of 20-year-old Dustin Wedhe. He had been shot 9 times and had died on the Roberts' bedroom floor. Of course, the police immediately wanted Tracey's statement. She would have to repeat this story for investigators multiple times, and she spoke with the media. The specific source where I got her retelling of what happened was an article in the Des Moines Register published on December 21st, 2001, and it was written by Art Cullen. So, in this article, Tracey said she was home with her kids when Dustin came by and knocked at the door. He was looking to hang out with Michael, and Tracey told him that Michael wouldn't be home until later that night and he should just come back the next day. Dustin lingered a bit on the front porch, which made Tracey uncomfortable, but he eventually left. About an hour later, her 2 sons, 11-year-old Bert and her 3-year-old, were in their bedroom upstairs watching TV, while Tracey was nearby getting her 1-year-old daughter into the bath. Tracey heard their dog Maxine barking outside, and Maxine was a Rottweiler, so when she barked, everyone heard it. Tracey yelled out the window for Maxine to be quiet. Tracey then heard the front door open and what sounded like more than one person enter. She thought perhaps Michael was home early from his business trip and that his business partner must be with him. She looked down the stairwell and saw that there were indeed 2 men in the home, but neither were Michael nor his partner. These 2 men started immediately up the stairs. As they made their way up, Tracey grabbed her daughter and ran to her son's room with the intention of locking and barricading them all inside. She managed to get her daughter in the room, but then she was pulled back by the hair before she could get herself safely in there. She yelled for Bert to lock the door, which he did. Tracey had some pantyhose hanging over the banister, and one of the men grabbed the hose and wrapped it around her neck. As she fought the man off, her glasses were knocked off her face, so now everything was also blurry. The man continued pulling on the hose and yanking Tracey towards the stairs. She, at that point, blacked out. More pantyhose were then used to bind her hands together. Tracey came to when she heard her 11-year-old son screaming. This little boy had grabbed his baseball bat and ran out into the hall to try to defend his mother. His yelling had roused her. Bert said that one of the men told him that he had already taken care of his dad at the airport and he needed to shut up or he was next. Tracey, having regained consciousness and knowing that her son was now in harm's way, fought to get to her feet. One of the men, who was wearing a black leather jacket, grabbed her from behind under her arms. She used her strength and some leverage thanks to her height and pushed backwards, which slammed the man into the wall. At that point, he let go. Tracey then ran to her bedroom where she and Michael kept 2 loaded guns for protection. They were in a gun safe under the bed. Tracey got to the safe and started to open it when she was pulled back by her hair. As she was being pulled away, the door to the safe sprung open and she grabbed the 9mm. She put the gun over her shoulder and tried to pull the trigger, but the safety was on. She moved her finger around until the safety clicked off and she fired a couple of shots over her shoulder. She then turned and fired more. It was around 7 p.m., so it was dim in the room and she didn't have her glasses on. So Tracey didn't really know who she hit, if anyone. She did hear heavy breathing and what sounded like just one person running down the stairs. But she was more focused in getting to her children, who were screaming. Tracey at some point also grabbed the other gun from the safe and ran out of the room with both of the guns. She remembered stepping over something on her way to her kids, but it didn't click that it could have been a person. Tracey confirmed that her kids were okay, and they were about to make their way downstairs to call 911 when she saw something move in the shadows just inside her bedroom. She yelled, "Don't move," but the person moved again, and she used the second gun to shoot. The man stopped moving, and by the time Tracey got downstairs, Bert had already called 911. Tracey and the kids were all taken to the hospital, and the children were cleared of any injury, physical that is, and Tracey's neck injury was seen too. She said she was having difficulty swallowing, and she had severe bruising to her neck. It was while at the hospital that Tracey was told she had shot and killed the intruder, and that the intruder was Dustin Wedhe. Dustin had been killed by Tracey during what appeared to be a home invasion, yet the other man was on the loose, so Tracey gave a description, though it was vague because, like I said, it was dark and her glasses had been knocked off. But she believed the man was between the ages of 25 and 35, nearly 6 feet tall, with a slender build and dark wavy hair. Meanwhile, Dustin's family was also learning what happened. This was a small town, so it took no time at all for word to get out that someone had been killed at the Roberts' house, but no one knew who it was. A relative called Mona to tell her about it, and she assumed it was a domestic incident between Tracey and Michael, and she did have some reason to believe that. Months previously, Mona had been visiting with Tracey when Tracey confided in her that there were issues in the marriage. Tracey said she loved Michael, but things were just not working out. Mona didn't know how tense things were until a while later when she was at work. Mona was making calls for Michael when Tracey stormed in and began just screaming at Michael as though no one else was there. She was just in some sort of rage. Mona quickly got off the phone and excused herself the way you would. Not long after that, Michael gave her a severance check and basically told her not to come back to work. That incident and the abrupt ending of her employment led to some distance between Mona and the Roberts, so Mona wasn't sure the current state of the relationship. But when she heard there was violence in the home, obviously having seen Tracey scream at Michael immediately came back to her. She was upset to hear that it had escalated to the point that one of them had been killed. But then her husband, Brett, came home and rather urgently asked where Dustin was. Mona said he was out, but she didn't know where, and Brett said that he had seen Dustin's car parked at the Roberts' house. Mona immediately panicked. They drove down to the Roberts' house, and Mona asked an officer outside if Dustin was there. He said yes, he was. Knowing that there was a fatality at the house, she asked if Dustin was dead, and that's when she was told her son had been killed. Dustin's family was full of questions, and when they heard Tracey's story, they couldn't believe it. They couldn't understand how or why Dustin would have gone into the house and attacked Tracey. So they wondered, publicly, if it was possible that things were not exactly what they seemed. Not that Tracey was lying, but maybe she misunderstood what happened in regards to Dustin. Maybe Dustin had gone to the house for another reason and heard the attack, so he ran in to help. But then in the confusion of what happened, Tracey thought she was firing at her attacker, and instead it was Dustin. One thing that made them think this was that Dustin's car was parked in the driveway of the Roberts house. If he was there to break in, why did he park in full view of every passerby? It made more sense that he was there for a normal reason, perhaps to do some work or looking for Michael, and it was wrong place, wrong time. Michael Roberts said he wanted to believe that. It surprised him that Dustin would attack his family, and he told the media he knew that Dustin wouldn't have orchestrated anything. The other man, the unknown second intruder, would have had to have been the ringleader. But he couldn't see how Dustin wasn't involved based on Tracey saying that two men walked into the house at the same time. Tracey had fired behind her as she was being pulled back by the hair. If Dustin wasn't the one pulling her hair, he wouldn't have been the one who was shot. Bert had said he thought he heard one of the men say the word boss or maybe Ross, and Michael believed that it was likely Dustin calling the other man boss, further proving a connection between the men and that Dustin was the follower in this situation. Pretty much the only thing the Wedhe family and the Roberts family agreed on at that point was that they wanted the second man identified and found. Only then would Dustin's role be established, whether as a participant or an attempted rescuer, and maybe even the motive of the attack would be revealed. What no one knew at the time, or what no one should have known at the time, was that the police had a clue to the motive. It was found in a pink notebook on the front seat of Dustin's car. Inside were notes that were written in Dustin's handwriting that were essentially instructions to stalk, harass, and eventually murder Tracey Roberts and her 11-year-old son, Bert. And the person instructing Dustin to do this was Dr. John Pittman and his attorney. To explain who Dr. John Pittman was, we have to back up and get into Tracey's life before she and Michael met, moved to Early, Iowa, and before Dustin Wedhe entered their lives. Tracey Roberts, then Tracey Richter, was working as an X-ray tech in Denver, Colorado in 1986 when she met a talented medical student, John Pittman. The two hit it off right away as they had a lot in common. John would later say that it occurred to him in the first year or so of their relationship that they almost had too much in common. Everything he said he was interested in, Tracey quickly became enthusiastic about that thing too. But he brushed aside any doubts he had because the relationship was just so wonderful. 2 years after meeting, they married in 1988. The only significant issue in the relationship early on was John's family. Tracey told John that his mother had taken to calling her to yell and curse at her. Though John's mom denied doing this, he drew some solid boundaries with his parents. If they couldn't be kind to his wife, they weren't going to have a space in his life. He and his parents were estranged for about 2 years over this. In early 1990, John and Tracey welcomed their son Bert into the world. It was after Bert's birth that their relationship became more and more strained. According to John, Tracey would get angry over what he saw as little things. But anyone who has ever lived with another person knows that the thing you're mad about is often not the actual issue. But whatever the actual issue was, the two found themselves bickering frequently, and then in 1991, it turned violent. John was in the garage doing something when Tracey came in complaining about where he had left his shoes. The argument escalated from there until Tracey stormed off. When she came back into the garage moments later, she had a gun with her. According to John, she threatened him with it before she pulled the trigger. She didn't hit him, and the shock of the gun going off seemed to cut through Tracey's anger. She broke down. She was crying and apologizing, telling him that she had actually intended to shoot herself. John assured her it would be okay and calmed her down. Then when Tracey fell asleep that night and it was safe to do so, John called the police. She had convinced him that it was a suicide attempt and he wanted to get her help. The legal fallout from this was a citation for negligent discharge of a firearm, and Tracey had to attend court-ordered therapy, which she faithfully went to for about a year. That year was relatively smooth, but soon after Tracey stopped counseling, things started sliding back into old habits. Then John got a residency in Chicago, which is where Tracey was from, and they decided to move from Denver to Chicago together with Bert, even though the marriage was rocky, to put it mildly. According to John, one of the things Tracey said she would handle in regards to the move was to arrange the transport for their pets. John, who was a major animal lover, had 4 dogs and 3 cats. When the animals never arrived in Chicago, John asked Tracey about it, and she said the company she hired sent their pets to the wrong place, to a laboratory overseas, and there was nothing they could do about it. John was devastated imagining what was happening to his beloved pets. But one day, when he was back in Denver finishing up some things at the old house, John said he saw one of his cats roaming the neighborhood. It occurred to him that it was possible Tracey had never hired anyone to move the dogs and cats. He believed that she had instead just dumped his pets, and one of the cats had found their way home. This was the straw that shattered the camel's back. John was done, and he began to prepare for a divorce. Believing that Tracey was hiding things other than just what happened to his animals, he hired a PI to follow her. And this is where, if John is to be believed, things got really dark. The PI followed Tracey around and saw her in the company of a number of people while John was at work. These people were not on the up and up, and the private investigator expressed concern for John's actual safety, given that Tracey was spending her free time with criminals. The PI warned him to be cautious. One night, according to John, Tracey called him and asked when he would be home for dinner. She indicated that she was at home waiting for him. What she didn't know was that John's PI was behind her as she was driving. She wasn't home at all. According to John, the PI warned him not to go home, worried that Tracey had set him up to be attacked. John didn't go home, so we don't know if this was an overreaction, a misunderstanding, or if John had been in danger. We simply don't know. John and Tracey separated in June 1992 and began what would turn out to be a years-long custody battle. Though they initially attempted shared custody, it was far from a harmonious co-parenting situation. One of the things they did was trade accusations of abuse. John claimed Bert had bruises on him and said that Mommy had hit him, but Tracey said the bruises were actually from the nanny that John had hired. When John indicated he was going to file for full custody, using the accusations of physical abuse as his evidence, Tracey then countered by accusing John of sexually abusing his son. Shortly after that accusation was levied, flyers showed up under the windshields of cars parked outside John's work. They directly accused him of being a child abuser. Tracey denied placing the papers, but she did acknowledge that it was someone she knew who did it. In the end, the accusations of abuse against John were found to be false, and the two came to an agreement that they would have joint legal custody but Burt would primarily live with Tracey. The divorce was finalized in 1996, and Tracey soon remarried an Australian businessman named Michael Roberts, who she had met online. The two had talked online and on the phone for several months before Tracey went to Australia to meet Michael in person. As she was getting ready to head back to the U.S., they made the impulsive decision to get married right away. So, several months of online dating and 18 days of in-person dating, and they were husband and wife. Several months after their marriage, Michael moved to Chicago and in with Tracey and her young son. Michael later told 60 Minutes Australia that his assumption was that they would be in the U.S. for about 3 to 6 months while Michael got to know Tracey's son, and then they would all move to Australia. But when he got to the U.S., he found out that Tracey's ex-husband was very much involved in Burt's life and would never agree to Tracey moving him out of the country. No matter what Michael believed when he arrived in the U.S., there was a 0% chance they would go back to Australia together. Michael said at this point he considered divorcing Tracey and moving back home, especially after he claims he learned she had cheated on him at some point in their short relationship. But he decided to stay and try to make it work, not wanting to be another divorce statistic. 2 years later, Tracey and Michael, along with Burt and their infant son, moved to Early from Chicago. At some point, John Pittman moved out to Virginia, where he worked as a plastic surgeon. He was still involved in Burt's life and had joint legal custody, but it was hard to have full equal parenting time when he lived halfway across the country. The move in the space did not make things between John and Tracey any better. John ended up filing for full custody again in 2000, and there were 2 reasons given. The first was that Tracey had resurrected her previous accusations that John abused their son. The other issue was a call from social services. Michael and Tracey had gotten into a fight, and Tracey called 911. She accused Michael of assaulting her. Michael accused Tracey of having assaulted him and said that she called the police only after he said he wanted a divorce. But regardless, Michael was the one arrested. Because there were children in the home during a domestic dispute, social services became involved and they called John as his child was one of the ones affected. John and his attorney gathered all of these pieces and filed in court for a change in custody. John's attorney was confident that in taking this to court, they would be successful. So the entirety of 2001, up to the shooting death of Dustin Wedhe, had Tracey and John in this custody battle. Around the time of Dustin's death, Tracey was due to sit for a deposition. But if this notebook that the police found in Dustin's car was to be believed, Dr. John Pittman had decided to end things once and for all by having Tracey and their son killed. According to what was in the notebook, there was a specific plan. It read, quote, JP wants me to get/force his ex, TR, to kill her son and then commit suicide. And if that fails, plan B is to make it appear as though TR had committed the murder of her son and then committed suicide, end quote. Dr. John Pittman and his attorney obviously were investigated. Neither had been in Iowa at the time of the shooting, so obviously neither were the second man in the house. They also couldn't find much of a connection between John and Dustin, other than John having met one of Dustin's teenage sisters. She babysat Burt sometimes, and that's the context they met. There was no evidence of any communication between John and Dustin or John and anyone in Dustin's family. So it seemed odd that John would hire someone he didn't know to do this. But still, the investigators knew that notebook was a key to the crime because it was in Dustin's handwriting. But it was a key that only people involved would have known about. So the police withheld not just the information in the notebook, but the fact that they found a notebook at all. In the meantime, Dustin's mother was in the media saying the truth would come out one day, and Tracey was doing interviews as the mother who fought for her children's safety and won. The Roberts family spent that Christmas in Australia with Michael's family, hoping the time and distance would help them heal from what happened. When they were back in town, Tracey began communicating more with the county sheriff's department, hoping to get updates on the investigation. In a letter from February 2002, Tracey outlined why she believed her ex-husband, John Pittman, and his attorney may have been involved. She also said that she felt she could identify the second intruder if she saw his picture. 2 days after this letter, she followed up with an email mentioning that John might be in town for a deposition in the custody battle. Because she doubted he would speak with the police willingly, she offered for the investigators to provide any questions they had to her attorney who could slip them in during the deposition. This email does show how out of the loop Tracey was with the investigation, because she seemingly did not know that not only was John willing to be interviewed, but he already had been, and on the surface at least, it seemed like he was cooperating. Tracey was asked to sit down with a sketch artist to come up with a composite of the second man, but she declined. A lot of the reporting, as in most of it, says she, quote, refused to work with the sketch artist. And I find refused to be a loaded word. I'm willing to stay open to the possibility that Tracey turned it down for a reason, like she didn't think she got enough of a look at his face to provide the details needed. A bad sketch can be worse than no sketch at all. All other indications were that Tracey was answering police questions during this time, and she was reaching out to them periodically for updates. In March and June 2002, Tracey specifically asked the police if there was any potential link between John or his attorney and Dustin or his family. Not only did she want this information for the sake of her case being solved and knowing why she was attacked in her own home, she wanted it for her upcoming custody case. Because if John was involved in her being attacked, her son wouldn't be safe in his care, and she wanted to be able to present that in court. The police were unwilling to provide much information to her. The notebook and the contents were being held back from everyone, including Tracey. To the frustration of both the Roberts and the Wedhes, not much information on the investigation was being provided to anyone. From the outside, it looked like the case was stalling out. There appeared to be no leads on who the second man was, and from their point of view, it didn't look like there were any clues as to the motive either. Tracey believed her ex was the only person who had a motive to hurt her, so she kept trying to push the police in that direction. The stress was rough on both couples, but even more so on the Wedhes, who had lost their son and then had him painted as a criminal in the media. Dustin's parents, Brett and Mona, separated in the summer of 2002. Brett sunk into a deep depression. On Thanksgiving Day, 11 months after Dustin's death, Brett was found dead at Dustin's gravesite. He had taken his life, leaving behind a note speaking to the pain of losing his son. A month after this, Mona received a letter from Tracey. In it, Tracey accused Mona of working with her ex-husband John to have Dustin attack her. She also told Mona that she had been a horrible wife to Brett, which was just pouring salt in a very fresh wound. I don't know what Tracey thought Mona would do about a letter like this, but she didn't retaliate immediately. Instead, she evaluated her position. She wanted more information on what exactly happened in the Roberts house that day, and the only way she would get more information would be to file a lawsuit. As we've seen in other cases, in 2003, Mona filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Tracey, arguing that Tracey did not have to use lethal means that day. So Tracey had the custody battle with John still going on. She had a wrongful death lawsuit against her. And then in early 2004, she was facing another legal battle when Michael Roberts filed for divorce. According to Michael, he learned that Tracey was cheating on him and that she applied for a large life insurance policy on his life. When Tracey found out that he knew, Michael said she drugged him, and then, after he passed out, she attempted to suffocate him. She wrapped him in a sheet and put a plastic bag over his head. He woke up with Tracey sitting on him. She told him this was some sort of trust exercise and that he needed to take deep breaths until he passed out. And then when he was unconscious, she would take the bag off his head and he would see that she could have killed him, but she didn't, so he could trust her. Michael didn't trust her and fought back. Though he survived, he was left with injuries. Michael reported the attempt on his life to the police and even had the Iowa's Victims Compensation Fund pay for some of his medical expenses. So he had to have proven to some degree that he was the victim of something like an assault. However, the police said there wasn't enough there to press charges against Tracey, and as far as I can tell in the Iowa court lookup, she was never charged. Michael obviously filed for divorce. He said he had been hanging in there in the marriage, waiting for his kids to be older since he didn't want to leave little ones alone with Tracey. But he felt at that point his life was in danger and he had to leave. He later learned that this large policy that Tracey had applied for wasn't the only one. She actually had 3 life insurance policies on him, at least one that she had been paying on for years, and he didn't know about any of them. He contacted the companies and they would not let him cancel those policies since, although they were on his life, they weren't actually his policies. As long as Tracey kept paying the premiums, they would stay good. Michael was horrified and terrified, so he went to law enforcement. Then law enforcement went to the companies and said that the existence of the policies put Michael's life in danger. So the companies did eventually cancel the policies, and they would have had to refund Tracey the premiums. 60 Minutes Australia had the letters canceling the policies and reported that they actually cited the risk to Michael's life as the reason they were canceling them. Less than a month after Michael filed for divorce, Tracey then contacted the sheriff's office and said she now believed that it was Michael, not John, who was behind the home invasion. Michael, as a suspect, filled in all the spots the investigators couldn't make work with John. Michael knew Dustin. In fact, Dustin looked up to him. And if he was going to be ordered into doing something, Michael was someone Dustin would listen to. And the targets were Tracey and Bert. Michael's 2 children were not targets. And Michael just so happened to be out of town when the attack happened, which provided him with an excellent alibi. Add to that, Michael had taken a polygraph early on in the investigation, and his results were inconclusive. He later said that they were inconclusive because he held doubts as to Tracey's version of events, not that he had any special knowledge he was hiding from investigators. But Tracey said he did have special knowledge, and that knowledge was of the notebook. According to Tracey, Michael never told her directly that he knew about it, but rather he mentioned it in his sleep. Tracey told the police that Michael was prone to sleep talking, and one night he mumbled something about a journal, Tracey's ex-husband, and said that the journal would cover him in case they got caught. That wasn't the only time he mentioned a journal in his sleep, but it was the time that he provided the most details. Tracey was curious about this journal because Michael mentioned it enough in his sleep that she knew it had to have been important. Michael was the sort of sleep talker who would answer questions, according to Tracey. So one time when he was asleep and he was babbling on about the journal, she asked him where it was. And in response, Michael said Dustin had it. Tracey wanted to pass the information along to the officers in case it was relevant. And they definitely paid attention to this information because at this point, the notebook was still holdback information. So either Michael knew about it, and this was basically him confessing in his sleep, or Tracey knew about it, and she was making this up to implicate him. Regardless, this holdback information was not going to be kept quiet much longer. Mona Wedhe's wrongful death case against Tracey did bring out more information as she hoped for, and the journal/notebook was one of those things. Mona did eventually drop the lawsuit. It was getting expensive, and she was warned that continuing it may compromise the investigation. Still believing that her son was innocent and a victim in all this, she backed off in the hopes the truth would eventually come out. After the suit was dismissed, Tracey contacted the county sheriff to let them know that she knew the notebook existed now, and she asked that a copy of it be sent to her attorney. She thought it might be relevant in her divorce and custody battle with Michael. It does not appear like the investigators complied with her request. In 2007, Tracey and Michael's divorce was settled except for custody. And then in 2008, the custody order was issued giving Tracey full physical custody and Michael had liberal visitation. This arrangement seemed a little surprising, seeing as the court also found that Tracey had acted in a deceitful manner on a number of occasions when she accused Michael of abusing her and their children. But that didn't prevent her from getting primary custody. After the divorce, Tracey moved from Iowa to Omaha, Nebraska, which is about 2 hours away. Michael ended up moving there too in order to be closer to the kids. In February 2009, it was announced that the police were reopening the case of Dustin Wedhe in an attempt to definitively determine what had happened and if there were additional people involved, to identify them. Around the same time, Tracey filed for a restraining order against Michael. The day before the hearing for that order, which was in March 2009, Tracey called the Omaha police to report a vehicle break-in. Her car was parked and unlocked when someone opened the door and left behind a graphic crime scene photo of Dustin's body. Tracey told the police that she believed Michael or someone acting on his behalf had put it in her car to intimidate her. The Omaha police did not know the context of this photo or about Dustin's case, so Tracey showed them printouts of articles from the internet about what happened. The police contacted Michael, who denied having anything to do with the photo in the car. The investigators expected him to deny it, but they did believe him. Leaving the photo in Tracey's car didn't seem to benefit him, but it would have bolstered Tracey's case for a restraining order. When the Omaha police interviewed Tracey again, they brought this up. She was the one who would have benefited, and it didn't make sense that Michael would have done this. Tracey also would have had access to that photo as part of her files from the wrongful death case. Tracey was angry at this accusation, which I think is a fair reaction whether she planted the photo or not. The day after that, Tracey left 2 messages for the Omaha investigator. The Omaha World Herald described the messages as, quote, rambling and scathing. Tracey then emailed an investigator in Iowa, the one who was heading up the reinvestigation into Dustin's death. She thanked him for being professional and said that the Omaha police were not. She wrote that one day Michael would hurt someone, and when it happened, she would just sit back and say, "I told you so." Tracey then said she prayed that Michael never hurt their children. And instead of stopping there, Tracey kept going, saying that wouldn't it be lovely if he hurt the children of the Omaha detective who didn't believe her about the photo. She wrote that fantasizing about that kind of stuff was just about the only thing that got her through moments like those. Later that same day, Tracey sent another email and said that the Omaha detective had, quote, just made the list. These emails were interpreted as possible threats against the detective's family. The concern was that Tracey would try to set Michael up for it. They ended up giving the detective's family protection, pulled him off the case, and unfortunately for Tracey, the Omaha police began looking closely into her background. They found that over a year earlier, in February 2008, Tracey had gotten a driver's license in Iowa under the name Sophie Edwards. She also tried to get her Social Security card changed to that name and applied for and got a new passport in this name. One document used to prove her name change was her divorce decree from Michael that restored her maiden name, except instead of saying Tracey Richter as the restored name, it said Sophia Corinna Therese Baronin von Richterhausen Edwards, which is a mouthful. The investigators believed she had forged this new name onto the document. Also, when applying for the passport, Tracey provided an affidavit from Lisa Roberts, Michael's sister, backing up her name change. This affidavit raised an immediate red flag when Lisa's name was spelled incorrectly. Lisa's name is supposed to be spelled Leisa, not Lisa like it was on the affidavit. Beyond that, Lisa Roberts hadn't been in the United States in nearly a decade, so she certainly couldn't have presented herself to sign anything in front of a notary in Nebraska. So the investigators believed that Tracey had forged this as well. Michael believed that these fake documents were intended to use to flee the country with her children. But she hadn't done that. What she did do was use the Iowa ID under the name Sophie Edwards to get financing to buy a car. If she had not legally changed her name and obtained this ID with fake papers, that is identity fraud. And it gave the investigators what they needed to get a search warrant for Tracey's apartment. This search is where they found evidence of the altered court document. Something else they found on this search, which is kind of besides the point, but it made me do a double take, was that Tracey had a petition for a name change form all filled out, but it hadn't been filed. The name Tracey wrote on that paper for what she wanted to change her name to was not Sophie Edwards, but rather the name of Michael Roberts' new wife. So Tracey contemplated, to the point of filling out the paperwork, changing her name to her ex-husband's new wife's name. She hadn't gone through with it, so whatever she was planning, it looks like she thought better of it, but you do have to wonder why she considered it at all. Tracey was arrested and charged with a few crimes like felony perjury for falsifying the DOT form in Iowa, which she was convicted of. Then she was charged with criminal impersonation and welfare fraud, with the welfare charge coming when they found she received food stamps in one name while allegedly hiding assets in a bank account under a different name. Tracey eventually pleaded no contest to the welfare fraud charge, which means she accepted guilt without admitting to guilt. Tracey and her mother have both made statements indicating that they believed she was being targeted because the Omaha detective had a grudge against her. All of the investigations into Tracey were happening out in front, while the reinvestigation into Dustin's death continued more quietly. Until when, in July 2011, it was announced that an arrest was made in the case. Not of a second intruder, but of 45-year-old Tracey Roberts, who was now going by Tracey Richter. They charged her with first-degree murder. After the arrest, the public was informed that the police had been looking at Tracey for a long time. From statements made, it sounds like they were looking at Tracey within a few months of the shooting. At some point, the case had been taken to the prosecutor, but he declined to prosecute. They had evidence, but not enough for a trial. Then a new prosecutor was elected, and he looked over the case, hoping to find enough to settle this once and for all. The theory of the crime here is similar to what happened in the Louis Gumpenberger case. If you're not familiar with that one, a woman named Pam Hupp shot Louis to death after claiming he attacked her, saying that he was demanding Russ's money. When the police arrived, they found a note on Louis's body that essentially said the same thing. He was there to get Russ's money. In the end, it turned out that Pam had set the whole thing up, trying to frame a man named Russ Faria for trying to kill her. And that's what the police said Tracey was trying to do here as well. Frame her ex-husband for trying to kill her by staging an attack where she had to fight for her life. Their theory was that Tracey had Dustin over earlier in the day and had him write out the notebook entries in his own handwriting. It's not clear what she used to convince him to go along with this, but one idea was that she may have tried to play on his affection for their family. She could have told him that Bert's abusive father was trying to take him away, and this would save him. After writing out what Tracey told him to, Dustin left the house only to come back later. Maybe he was even told to pretend he was attacking Tracey to sell the story to the children who were witnesses. Dustin would have been unaware that he was going to be killed in this process. He thought he was just doing something to help. Instead, Tracey killed him to prove she had been attacked. So, what pushed this from a theory into enough evidence for an arrest? It turned out it was going to be that notebook that Dustin left behind that was key to the case. Tracey had claimed in her emails to the investigators that she learned about the notebook in 2005 when the wrongful death suit had been going on. But during the reinvestigation, the authorities had spoken to Tracey's friend Mary Higgins. Mary said that she was talking to Tracey about a month and a half after the shooting when the Roberts family had been back from Australia. Tracey told Mary what had happened at the house, which Mary was surprised that Tracey told it with little emotion. As Tracey was talking, Bert came in and was upset. He asked Tracey why she had to go back up there and that she didn't have to kill him. Tracey yelled his name and he left the room. Tracey went on to tell Mary that there was a pink notebook found that would prove her ex-husband John was behind the break-in, and Tracey said she expected he would soon be arrested. Mary didn't tell the police about the notebook at the time because she didn't realize it was hold-back information. She had no idea the relevance of Tracey knowing about it that early on. It was only when she mentioned it during the reinvestigation and saw the reaction that she realized this was significant. Mary also told the police that at some point in 2004, about 2 years after first telling Mary about the notebook, Tracey told her to forget about it. And this timing was in line with when Tracey stopped accusing John of trying to kill her and started accusing Michael. And Mary's information about the notebook, not just that it existed, but its color and contents, told the investigators that her information was solid. This was the piece they needed, but like I said, it wasn't the only piece. Little things had been nagging at the investigators from the start, like why did Dustin park in front of the house where anyone could have seen his car while he was committing what was going to be a murder? Why didn't the second man take Dustin's car to get away? Why were there no items knocked over upstairs to indicate this life or death struggle that Tracey described? How, in the dark and without her glasses and with her hands tied together for most of the shots, how did Tracey in that situation fire 11 times and hit Dustin 9? Those were questions the investigators had early on that were never fully answered. They also had some information from Dustin's mother, Mona, that they hadn't released either. Rather than Dustin showing up at the house unannounced like Tracey said, Mona claimed that Tracey had actually invited him over. She and Tracey were discussing a real estate deal that Mona was helping the Roberts with, and Tracey told her to have Dustin come over the next day or two to do some copy work for Michael's company. Mona told Tracey that Dustin really wasn't a fast worker when it came to that sort of thing, but Tracey told her it would be fine. They could just have him try it out and see if he could manage the task. That's why Dustin went over there, according to Mona, and that's why he parked out front, not worried anyone would see his car since he was just there to get work done. And that's why Mona believed early on that Dustin must have stumbled across Tracey being attacked and tried to help. It's why she said she knew the truth would come out one day, even though she was hesitant to say too much publicly because she didn't want to interfere with the investigation. The truth, or at least the truth according to the state, didn't come out until they learned how early Tracey knew about the notebook. And that's what got this case to trial just 3 months after the arrest. Obviously, Mary Higgins testified at trial as to what she was told by Tracey about the notebook. But she also knew something else. She remembered that at the beginning of the school year in the fall of 2001, Tracey bought Bert notebooks for school. One of them was pink, and Tracey mentioned how Bert refused to take it to school with him. This story places a pink notebook, like the one found in Dustin's car, in Tracey's home, if Mary was remembering accurately a decade later. Tracey's defense to the bombshell notebook testimony was that it was Mary who brought up the notebook first, having heard about it from someone else. Tracey didn't have independent knowledge of it, and what the police had was a leak in their department. Also testifying at the trial for the state was a crime scene reconstructionist who said he believed, based on the spatter of dried blood, that the last shot or shots to Dustin's head occurred 15 minutes after the first set of shots. That would probably explain Mary's testimony about Bert coming in and saying, "Why did you go back up there and you didn't have to kill him?" This contradicted Tracey's retelling of how quickly everything happened. The expert also testified that the shots to the back of the head were fired while Dustin was lying on the ground face down. Tracey said she saw the person she shot still moving in the shadows, and that's why she fired again. The state was saying that he couldn't have been moving, and what really happened was that Tracey went back up to shoot Dustin in the head 10 to 15 minutes after the initial shooting to make sure he was dead. The notebook was then entered into evidence, and the jury heard about what was in it. It wasn't just the instructions on stalking and killing Tracey and Bert, but also details about her ex, John. Perhaps things to make it look like Dustin knew John. Things about how he was a white male in his 40s, he was an army surgeon, and slightly overweight. All of that might be something that Dustin could have learned just from meeting John, but then it included more in-depth things like how John had become a surgeon because his father was one, but he had actually wanted to be a psychiatrist. The sort of things John wouldn't have just told a hired hitman. These aren't things that Dustin would have known about John, but Tracey knew them, and so did Michael. And this is where I was surprised the defense did not set Michael up as the main reasonable alternative suspect. What was in the notebook about John was known to Michael. He was friendly with Dustin and could have easily had him write down whatever he told him. And like I said before, think about the two people the notebook made it sound like John wanted dead, Tracey and Bert. 4 people in the house, and the 2 that were to be spared were Michael's children. To be perfectly clear, I do not think Michael Roberts had anything to do with Dustin's death at all. I do not think he set Dustin up to go try to kill Tracey and Bert. I'm not sitting here contemplating his guilt or innocence publicly on this podcast. He definitely doesn't deserve that. I'm just talking legal strategies. And when we're talking about reasonable doubt and I'm looking for ways to expand that doubt in a potential juror's mind, Michael is where I would look. And Michael wasn't entirely spared, but the defense did have other theories as well. Because the defense was that Tracey told the truth back on day 1 and continued to tell the truth for the next 10 years. She was attacked by 2 men in her home. She opened fire to protect herself and her children, killing 1 man in the process while the other got away. That was her story in the beginning, and that was her story now. Rather than Dustin being the innocent 20-year-old who wouldn't have acted out this way, The defense presented evidence that Dustin did have behavioral issues in the past, including injuring his sister once and pulling a gun on his father. According to his medical records, he was treated for depression and anti-authority behaviors. The defense said he was a troubled and violent young man who was fully capable of committing this crime. And to give an idea of someone Dustin may have committed this crime with, they pointed at a man named Jeremy. At the time of Dustin's death, his mother Mona was having an affair with Jeremy, and the defense theorized that he could have been the second man in the house. The reason his name came up was because Mona mentioned him to the police a few weeks after the shooting. And she brought him up because he had broken off their relationship hours after Dustin died. The timing seems suspicious, but Mona said that at that point, she was just throwing out names to the police. She didn't really think Jeremy did it, but she was trying to just give the police leads. Jeremy testified that he had nothing to do with the home invasion, and he didn't even know Dustin very well. They didn't have the sort of relationship that would lead them into a criminal conspiracy together. But the defense had 2 Post-it notes from Dustin's room and said one hinted towards a connection. On one of the notes was a hotel phone number to a hotel over 2 hours away from Dustin's home. He seemed to have no connection to the hotel. However, it was somewhere that Mona and Jeremy had stayed together. Maybe Mona gave it to him in case of an emergency while she was out of town, but the defense was saying who's to say he wasn't calling Jeremy. The other Post-it note said, quote, "Money in November." The alleged break-in was in December, so why did Dustin write down something about money in November? Was he possibly expecting to get paid in advance for attacking Tracey? The defense also had an eye and ear witness to call to the stand. Remember, Tracey's son saw some of what happened that night, and he was 11 years old at the time, so he's definitely old enough to be aware and articulate, unlike his 3-year-old and 1-year-old siblings. 21 at the time of trial, Burt testified as to what he saw, which backed up his mother's story. On cross-examination, the prosecution looked at points in Burt's testimony a decade later that weren't in his original statement. For instance, he testified he was in his room when his mother came in with his sister and a man pulled her out of the room. That was part of Tracey's story, but it didn't appear in Burt's original statement to the police. He also testified to noises he heard, like banging, kicking, and choking sounds. He also said he saw Dustin Wedhe try to get up, and Tracey then told him to stay down. In the original statement, Burt didn't say he had witnessed any of those things. Burt contended that it was a combination of the officer not writing everything he said down, and Burt being an 11-year-old who had just experienced trauma and had possibly left some stuff out. But really, when we're talking 10 years down the road, it's impossible to say which pieces were original memories and which were things he had unintentionally picked up from hearing the story from Tracey's point of view. Memories are malleable. I think Burt testified to the best of his recollection, like the other witnesses at trial who were subject to the same fuzziness that time puts on all memories. From the stand, Burt did insinuate that his ex-stepfather Michael was possibly involved in setting this up, and the defense let him put it out there, but like I said before, they didn't really push it as the singular alternative theory. An interesting defense witness was the former prosecutor from the county who had previously declined to take this case to trial. He was asked why, and he answered that it was because the initial investigation was far too flawed. The responding officers took Tracey's statement at face value, and they didn't process the scene properly. They didn't do things like take fingerprints, figure out the trajectory of the shots while the body was still at the scene, or even taking Tracey's clothes into evidence. There were enough missing pieces that he wasn't confident they could contradict her story of self-defense. Tracey did not take the stand, rather letting her previous statements to the police and the media speak for themselves. Someone else who didn't testify was a psychologist who examined Tracey and said she displayed symptoms of PTSD/acute stress syndrome when she talked about the shooting. This would contradict the state's theory that Tracey just coldly executed a 20-year-old man just to score points in a custody case. The defense wanted the testimony in. However, the state said if it was allowed, they would have more questions about other things in Tracey's life that might have caused signs of acute stress, like her never-ending custody battles and her other legal issues. Things that had been deemed inadmissible because they were more prejudicial than probative, or because they were irrelevant to the case, would suddenly be back on the table. The judge heard out both sides and ruled that the psychiatric testimony would hurt Tracey's case more than it would help, so the jury never heard it. When the jury took the case, they were advised of their options: acquittal, first-degree murder, or second-degree murder. They were going to have to separate out their feelings at Tracey Richter from the evidence of the murder. They could think that Tracey tried to use Dustin's death to get back at her ex-husband, while also thinking she was innocent of intentional murder. They could find that she was being manipulative and not very nice without thinking that she set up this elaborate scheme to frame John Pittman. After the jury deliberated, they came back with a verdict of guilty for first-degree murder. Tracey's head dropped to the table at the reading of the verdict, and Dustin's mother, Mona, started shaking. She barely processed anything said after the verdict. At sentencing, Tracey continued to maintain her innocence, and she said she was telling the truth. This was a home invasion, and she did what she had to protect her family. Even so, she still apologized to Dustin's mother, admitting that she would rather go to jail for the rest of her life and have her children alive than lose one of them, even if she was free. She acknowledged that Mona was the victim, but still said she did not murder Dustin. Tracey was then sentenced to life in prison. Tracey's family, including her son Bert, are still advocating for her innocence. I usually change the names of minors in my episodes, but Bert has been in the forefront of Tracey's wrongful conviction campaign. Bert doesn't just stand by her because that's his mom, but rather because he was the only other surviving witness, and he stands by what he remembers seeing and hearing. He doesn't believe Tracey set up some scene for him to witness. After Tracey's arrest, Michael had taken the kids and moved repeatedly, trying to keep Tracey and her family from having their address. Though Tracey was granted some visits and phone access to the children, Michael told 60 Minutes Australia that he wouldn't force the kids to visit Tracey if they didn't want to, which landed him in contempt. Parental rights are not automatically severed due to incarceration. And Tracey's parental rights also meant Michael ended up, for a time, in a precarious legal situation, according to his 2012 interview with 60 Minutes Australia. He was no longer eligible to stay in the U.S. under his visa, but he was also forbidden from taking the kids back to Australia with him. But according to the Des Moines Register, he and his kids did return to Australia around 2014, and they are at this point adults. If this was a podcast that covered family and civil law, this would be a 10-part series. Michael has accused Tracey, her mother, and others of purposely defaming him online in their attempts to exonerate her. In turn, Tracey's family has accused the prosecutor of using his position to harass and punish Tracey even more. It's been an absolute mess of court filings, but let's go ahead and focus on the victims who found themselves in the middle of this storm. Dustin Wedhe, who was killed. His parents, one who couldn't find his way past his grief. And all three of Tracey's children caught between their mother, their fathers, the family court system, and the criminal court system. Everyone here has lost so much. And then there is Tracey Richter, who has lost her freedom, though whether or not she's a victim depends on your perspective and your opinion on her guilt or innocence. Her appeals have not yielded a favorable result for her, but her family will not give up fighting for her exoneration. Thank you for listening. You can find Crime Lines on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and occasionally TikTok. Crimelines is on Patreon, where I offer early and ad-free episodes as well as bonus content. Visit patreon.com/crimelines. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crimelines, you can give a one-time donation at basementfortproductions.com/support. And if you need a palate cleanser after listening to heavier true crime shows, check out Rusty Hinges, an allegedly funny history, mystery, and true crime show that I co-created and write for.